Welcome to another Tech Stuff Tuesday. This week, we're going to look at testing your electrical system. So why would you want to do this? Well, maybe you have low voltage, lower than it used to be, lower than you think it should be, and you're not exactly sure why you have this voltage problem. Maybe it's a connection. Maybe you have a fuse that is about to blow, but not quite, so it's still connected. These are things you can check kind of visually, grab on the connectors, that kind of thing, but you've done all this and now you don't know where you're at. Maybe you have a bad battery, bad capacitor. We don't know. So this is how you would find out. What we've got here is a load tester. I picked this up maybe 6, 7, 8 years ago. I remember how much it was then, maybe 30, 40 bucks. I have no idea what they go for now. They're pretty inexpensive. From what I understand, these are not very accurate. I haven't tested the accuracy of this, but we do have an ammeter and a voltmeter. For this purpose, it may be better to have something a little more precise, but we're going to go off of what we have just because this is what you'd pick up and this is what the average person is going to do. They're not necessarily going to check how accurate all of these things are. So we're going to go off of this just as a baseline and we'll kind of go from there. We have a DMM, so we can check voltage. That's going to be a critical point here. And what we're working with in this instance is 3 cap banks. Now, all of these cap banks were completely flat dead yesterday. I charged all 3 of them up together at the same time to 13.5 volts. And because these are not balanced, I knew they would fall off. The first time you charge any cap banks that are not balanced, they will hold a charge, but they will fall off over some time, which I anticipated happening on these. If you're using balance, they won't fall off as far, but also after you cycle these a few times, or if they've been in your car for a while, you won't have these problems where it just drops off so bad, unless you have a bad cell. So what we're going to do, we're going to assume that all 3 of these in your application have been pulled out. You're thinking maybe something is wrong with one of these or several of these. So we're going to determine what's happening here. This same thing would apply if you treat this like a battery. If you pull it straight out of the system, you let it sit overnight like I did on these. If you have 2 batteries that you pulled out and they were 12.8 volts and then one of them happens to be 10 volts because it just sat overnight, congratulations, you've already found the problem. That battery is going to be bad. If all 3 of them are reading relatively similar, that's when we may have to implement the load test, and that's where we're going to get into that. Now for caps, it can be a little bit different because we have 5 of these. One of these could be bad, causing a problem, not just the whole bank, or you may have an entire bank of them that has a problem, but we can narrow it down. All 3 of these, if everything is fine, should read the exact same voltage. So that's going to be step 1. Now remember, I charged these to 13.5 volts. They've sat overnight, actually a little bit more than that. We're probably close to about 18 hours they've been sitting. So we're going to check the positive and the negative, and we have 10.22 volts on this bank. So this fell more than I thought it should for sitting overnight. But we are going to check the next bank. 10.69. So both of these are relatively close. I'll try the third one here. And 11.26. So this one is substantially higher than the others. I don't have a baseline of how much it should have dropped because they were not balanced and that kind of thing. But this kind of tells me that this one is probably more healthy than both of these. So what we can do from here, you can leave them connected and do this, or you could disconnect them if you want to go through all the extra effort. So because this is down at 11.26 volts, we should have around 2.25 or so volts per cell, and that should indicate a good cell. So if we check these individually, remember you're trying to go positive and negative, and if you have polarity reversed, it's not going to be a wrong number, it's just going to say negative volts. So we have 2.29. That would indicate this should be a good cell. 2.3, again, should be a good cell. 2.2, should be a good cell, because remember, these are not balanced. 2.2 here, 2.18. So while this entire thing did fall off, it appears that they've balanced themselves out pretty well sitting overnight, as they tend to do. So we can't necessarily go off of any one of these is bad. The whole thing did fall, and we can look at that a little bit later. So we'll look at the next batch. 2.5, 2.5, 2.5, 2.5, 0.6. This would indicate this cell is bad. This one cell being bad can definitely hurt the performance of the whole system. So we have one that most likely is bad, as the rest of these are 2.5. So this may be all of the problem. But we will continue on to the next group. Remember, this one fell down quite a bit lower than the rest of these, so more than likely we're going to find one of these that is also bad. 1.37, 0.97, 2.4, 2.7, 2.7. So it looks like we probably have two cells in here that are bad. This would also be contributing to the problem. So of these three banks, we've got multiple cells that appear to have a problem. These would want to be completely removed from the system. That could alleviate all of our issues. That's how we got there on checking all of those. Now you can individually check these from a load test if you want to do that, but this is a quick, easy way to do it without the load tester to kind of verify that. Odds are, if you have these balanced, or they tend to balance themselves out over time, if you've got one that's reading 2 volts less than the rest, that cell's going to be bad. So let's say you did want to use the load tester. We suspect that this one's got problems, but we're going to confirm that. So to do that, we're going to charge this bank back up to a normal operating voltage, and then we're going to do the math and see exactly how long it should last with a particular load on it. All right, so we've got this charged back to 13.37 volts. So this is something that you might pull out of the car, might show this a little bit lower. But our voltage here says it's about 12.8. So this voltage is not accurate by quite a bit, about half a volt. So I suspect that our amperage may also be off. Regardless, this is what we've got. It's what we're going to use. Now, these caps are 3000 farad, 2.7 volts. If you do the math on these caps, they are 3 watt hour, which is 0.23 amp hours. That is not much at all. 0.23 amp hours. If we put a 50 amp draw on these, it should last for 16 seconds if it is a good 100% functioning bank. So to use this, we ramp this dial up and it's going to gradually go up. I'm going to try my best to get it right there at 50 amps. And it should last 16 seconds till dead if this is a working bank, which pretty sure it's not. But this is what we're going to find out. You can do the same thing for a battery. You would take the amp hour rating of the battery, say it's 100 amp hours. You divide that by the current that you're putting on it, so you can select the current. Let's say you did 100 amps. You can do that 100 divided by 100, and that will give you the amount of time in hours that it should last. Being a 100 amp hour with 100 amps, it should last for 1 hour. It kind of explains itself with that example. But if you do the math for any amperage that you choose, you take the amp hour rating, you divide that by the number of amps, and that is the amount of time in hours, which you can figure out minutes, seconds, otherwise, to see what a working scenario should be for that. So we're going to ramp this up to 50 amps. We've seen we've fallen down to 13.2. It's kind of leveling out. Discharging again, pretty sure more than one of these cells is bad. but we're going to put 50 amps on it. And it's dropping pretty hard. So it didn't just absolutely plummet. So that's going to be a bunch of these cells doing pretty well, but we saw that they were definitely a little bit low on 2 of them. So is this indefinitely bad? Well, I think it might be off of checking the individual cells, but we could do a little bit more load testing or just disconnecting these and letting them sit. If one of them just drastically falls off as we saw, then it is definitely bad. But I do think this could do better. In this case, we have other ones that we can test. So what we'll do here is I will charge back to about the same voltage on the one that is operating much better, and we'll use that as a point of reference. We'll check that one the same way and compare the 2 results, since we have one that appears to be better shape than the other one that's bad. So this is the best charged of the bank initially that appears to have everything good. We've got it at 13.35 volts. And again, this ammeter may not be accurate. The voltage is off. This may not be accurate. So if we're trying to go for nailing an exact, we ran it for 16 seconds, it's dead, it did this. It said 50 amps here. It could be 20, it could be 100. We don't know for sure because this has questionable accuracy. With a current clamp, we could check that to be the most precise on that. But because we're comparing one to another, it's a little bit less worrisome about if it's accurate. So this one I'm going to take up to 50 amps, and then I'm going to leave that for several seconds, and we can compare this one to the other one and see if we have a variance there. If we do, that will kind of confirm we definitely have some bad cells, and these are probably good. You can tell just sitting here, the voltage isn't really fluctuating like the other one did so much, but let's put 50 amps on it. And now we can compare the results between this bank and that should tell us if we have a performance difference between the 2. Interestingly enough, in that test, both had almost identical voltage drop over that same 16 seconds. So from that, I would say it's possible that we do not actually have bad cells. However, the fact that all of them kind of balanced out and then you have one that's really, really bad, that to me instinctually says that's one that's a bad cell. So where the difference might come in is if we have a very large current draw where all of the cells are going to be strained, that might be the difference in showing that. But it would be worth investigating the cell that drops off, maybe charge that individually and just let it sit. We know if it just falls off sitting there, it is definitely a bad cell. So we have a little bit of inconclusive data from that particular test with these cells, but when you're doing it with a battery, you're probably going to get a more decisive result, as I have seen historically. Now remember, the same thing will apply if you've got batteries instead of capacitors. If you load test one of them and it all of a sudden has a huge fall off where the other ones don't, that battery is definitely bad. You can have one battery in a whole bank. Say you have 10 batteries, you can have one bad battery causing massive voltage drop and electrical problems in the vehicle. So you want to make sure that you're on top of that. Maybe check that once a year, or 6 months if you really want to, especially if you've got aging batteries. In this case, these capacitors, I don't know the full history on them. These were purchased used. These came directly out of a Los Angeles hybrid bus. They took these out of service, which means they did not feel that they were in good enough condition for them to continue to use them in buses for public transport. They took them out. I purchased a ton of these things. That's where these came from, and they're several years old that I've had them. So I think I've had these for 3 or 4 years on top of their original age. These things very well could be 8 years old. I don't know the full history on them, but that would be the thing to look at with used caps. Yes, they are cheaper. However, you don't know what you're getting. You can have bad cells that you have to check individually, and you don't know the total lifespan of what they've got left. So that's why you should buy new caps from emfcaraudio.com. You know what you're getting, and there's a warranty on those as well. So now that we've looked at this, there's still one other aspect: testing your alternator. Maybe it's not putting out as much power as it used to. Maybe it never put out rated power. Maybe it's just fine and you have a problem somewhere else, like batteries, something like that. So now we're going to look at testing your alternator. Now we're going to check out the alternator. So now that we're under the hood, we've got two alternators on this vehicle. One is going to the battery over here. There is a battery cable upgrade. It is 4 gauge, and I'll get back to why this matters here in a little bit. And then we have a second alternator. Now these alternators are separate. In the back, they would go to battery banks, cap banks, that kind of thing. They have wires dedicated run from the alternators to back there, but we have nothing connected back there. And that is very critical, because when we put load on the system, we don't want those storage items to take any of that load at all. We want all of the load to come from the alternator if possible. In this case, it is. So the only thing I have connected in the system here is the battery under the hood via a 4 gauge wire right here. Now, this 4 gauge wire, is it sufficient for these 370 amp alternators? No, they are not. The intent of this system was to have all of the charging, the bulk of the amperage go to the back. The front is just for normal function, the normal vehicle function. So 4 gauge was a good upgrade from the very old 1994 8 gauge that was in there. So that was just an upgrade just to keep the vehicle running smoothly. I am not going to get 370 amps of current possible through that 4 gauge wire. So that is going to be a consideration for this particular test. I do know that these alternators work absolutely fine, but again, we're checking to make sure that everything works appropriately. So we are going to be limited by the wire itself. It's only about maybe a 6 foot run of wire at most. So we can still get quite a bit of current, well over 100 amps. Shouldn't be an issue, but we are going to check two things here. One, idle current, which is going to be around 500, 600, 700 RPM, depending on the vehicle. And you're not going to get a ton of current or anywhere near maximum current out of any alternator down that low. You're generally going to have to be up closer to maybe 1,000 or over or around 2,000. After that, you generally don't get more amperage by revving past 2,000. Most are going to make everything that they're going to make around or under 2,000 RPM on the motor. That's not the rotational speed of the alternator. So first things first, I'm going to put the current clamp on 1,000 amps DC as our maximum amount. It is on here backwards. If we flip it the other way, but you won't be able to see the display, it would be positive, but this is going to show negative current, which is fine. The numbers are still the same. So step one is going to be starting the vehicle. I'm going to leave the clamp here off for right now, and after it's running, I'll put that on and run that check. So you will note right away we've got 20 amps of draw, and that's going to be what the vehicle itself is using just on a normal basis. So there's not a whole lot going on in this van, so that's just going to be our running the van amperage. Now you might notice I have a second wire running through here. This goes to a brake controller that's in there. It is not connected, so we do not have any current draw happening through here. So you want to make sure you're only through from the alternator, but say this wire is essentially doing nothing. But if there was anything going through it, you would absolutely not want to include that. So we're down here now 16 amps, so the battery has gotten a little bit of recharge from starting. We have our ground right here. It's very difficult to get in under here, but there's a very short wire that goes from there to there. So we're connected to a body ground right there. We're going to connect our positive, showing 16 amps, and I'm going to ramp this up until this gets down to, maybe 11 volts, 11, 12 volts, and that's where we're definitely going to be in battery power. And whatever number that says, which again may or may not be accurate, we'll have to check from here, which will be accurate. We'll see exactly how much current that is. Once we're down into 12.5 volts, we're completely in battery storage. So it's almost 200 amps at 12, that's about 13. So 229 amps at about 12.5 volts or so, according to this. So we are definitely putting a load on that, and that is at idle. We're only at 500 RPM. So that is really doing some work at idle. Now we're going to ramp up the RPM. We're going to get it around 200, and we're going to try this again. So now we've got the RPMs up. We're going to try this again, get about the same level. $342 amps. So there you saw it with the engine rev, we got a lot more amperage out of it. 342 amps tested out of this current clamp out of one of those alternators, and that's 370 amps cold rated. There's also a hot rating that DC Power does. Not everybody does that. It's usually substantially less, but nevertheless 340 amps, very respectable. That is ample amount of power, and there's two of them, so I can support a ton of electrical on here. Now if that alternator was bad, we wouldn't get anywhere near rated power. We might get 100 amps or 50 amps, or maybe that's why your whole system isn't charging and it can't keep up, and that kind of thing, in which your alternator might be failing. But this one is definitely good. To be quite honest, I am shocked that this 4-gauge copper wire was able to pull that much current through it and held it. You saw how long it held those numbers. I was very, very shocked. So that does go to show that for a short period of time, a short length of 4-gauge wire can handle that much current. I would definitely not try to do it over a length of time. It is also worth noting this wire is not fused as it comes directly off the alternator. We would definitely not want to have that over any length of time where the wire could actually burn, but I am very impressed that it did hold that much current for that period of time. There are way better testers than these that you can actually set an amperage that it'll hold. There won't be any ambiguity. It'll just go straight to that load. It'll hold it, have different timers on it, that kind of thing. But those are much more expensive, and for the hobbyists who are just trying to figure out if your alternator's bad or your battery's bad or you have a bad cap, this will work just fine. Just remember, you probably don't want to go off of these gauges. Strong possibility they are not accurate. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up and make sure you subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell. If you want to support these videos so we can do more greater things, you can support us on Patreon. Make sure you follow us on Instagram and Facebook. I'll see you again on another Tech Stuff Tuesday.